The way to test to see if you've set a good boundary is if that boundary can be enforced without you saying a word to anyone else. And the reason why this is a good test is because oftentimes when we set a boundary, what we're really doing is trying to control someone else's behavior. And in that case, you have to communicate it to the other person in order for it to take effect. Whereas if you set a boundary, that intent should be to change your own behavior in response to a certain circumstance. For example, if your friend keeps showing up an hour late for events, you're no longer going to accept invitations from her, or you're going to leave the venue or whatever, some sort of change in your behavior as a result of the environment that's been created. So if you can enforce your boundary without saying a word, not saying you shouldn't say a word, because it is a courtesy to communicate your boundaries and give people an opportunity to meet you where you are. But if you could enforce it without saying a word, then it's a true boundary and it's not trying to control the behavior of others, which is what we slip into. So if you're a people pleaser, or if you are used to having people cross your boundaries, or you have a habit of crossing other people's boundaries, this can be really tough, because if you're trying to change that behavior, or if you're trying to gain control over your environment, it can be really tempting to want to grab hold of the people around you to change your environment. But the issue has been, and always has been, that you need to gain control of yourself. And so initially, when you're first starting to set boundaries, especially if you're a people pleaser and you think that you are doing the world a service by busting your boundaries all the time, it can be tempting to try to point the finger or to try to direct your energy towards what other people are doing. But at the end of the day, what matters is your choices. And people respond remarkably well to boundaries, especially when they're not spoken. Sometimes when you tell somebody what your boundary is, it creates confusion, or it triggers their wounds or their inability to respect boundaries. Whereas if you just change your behavior, a lot of times people will notice that change in behavior and naturally adjust their behavior as a result. And sometimes that means people will kind of drift out of your experience, which is good, because the whole point was to improve your own environment. And we can't expect people to bend to what it is that we expect from them. And so we have to respect people enough to allow them to make choices about how they behave on their own. And really, at the end of the day, that's what happens anyway, because if someone has no intention of showing up for you in a certain way, even if they pretend to do that at first, eventually it'll fade and you'll be right back in the same situation you were before. So I personally would rather not speak most of my boundaries out loud and just act on them, and just see how people respond to that. See how people choose, and this is my form of respect to others, to see how they choose to show up for me on their own. So like I said, this is a good test if you're new to setting boundaries, if you're trying to get a hold of it, if you have a habit of being a people pleaser, or if you have a habit of railroading over other people's boundaries. Test to see if your boundary can be enforced without a word. And also, it helps at first to write down the boundary, because sometimes seeing it on paper or even just hearing it out loud will help you understand if it's just controlling behavior, if it's just responding from trauma, etc.